All right, so we are back with part three, race and ethnicity. And I'm going to be honest with you, this is something that I'd much rather discuss in person. I like to be able to read your reactions face to face because this could be kind of a tricky one. Um, and it's nice to have those conversations in class. So if while listening to this you have any questions, please jot them down, send me an email. But let's get into this. The first thing is that race, ethnicity, right? White, black, Asian, Hispanic, any kind of this clustering that we do, these are not biological processes. They're social constructions. They're social economic. They're based on society. They're based on economic class. They're based on many things that are man made, not biological. So people ask, well, then how come you can identify somebody usually by their DNA and say whether they're African or European? We're not identifying their race when we look at DNA. When we look at DNA, what we can see is that certain populations have genetic markers, things that are different. Like maybe they have a this one gene here and this one gene there. But all that means is everybody who lived nearby, who probably were all related to each other, has that gene. And if they happen to be living in Africa, well, then we know that they came from Africa. But that gene doesn't make them African. We can't find any genetic basis for the different races that we see. And in fact, the races that we see differ over time and over country. We say what is it, if we say someone in America is black, that's a whole different type of meaning than we say if somebody in England is black. I mean, they may have a darker skin complexion and have African ancestry, but it's different. It's different social constructs about it. So let's get into that. First of all, races are identified in relation to other races. You're not white, you're black. You're not Latino, you're Asian, right? You're not Chinese, you're Korean. And so that's usually the big part, is that without other races, there would be no race, right? So in other words, Asian versus non-Asian. So if somebody comes from China, are they Asian? What if they come from India? We consider India part of Asia, but oftentimes we'll say they're Indian and not Asian. If somebody comes from the Philippines, we'll say they're Filipino, although we consider that to be part of Asia as well. So a lot of times it's based on definitions in relating to other things. Okay, and then this idea of groups, it's usually a social construction, and one of the ways they do this is to classify and to control. So, for instance, we can break down our population into different groups. You can either be white, black, Latino, or Hispanic, or Asian, or Native American, right? Well, think about this. Those terms are fluid. This is actual, I found this. This is an actual print off from the 1930 census, right? Every 10 years, the government goes around and asks, counts how many people are living here. And they ask some questions like, what's your nationality? These were instructions on how to classify people by race. So the first part is here for color or race, right? W for white, N for Negro, M for Mexican, IN for Indian, right? Chinese, Hindu, Korean. So we don't even use those terms anymore. And that's one thing that's changed. But look at this. Negroes. A person of mixed white and Negro blood should be returned as a Negro, no matter how small the percentage of Negro blood. Okay? So in other words, if somebody says, they have, they're white and black, if they have just one tiny part of black, then they're black, they're Negro. And that actually comes back defines from a really old law we used to have back in the time when they still had slavery in the United States based on race. The way they defined people who were black or slaves was what they called the one drop rule. As long as you had one drop of black blood, you were black. And one of the reasons for that was, unfortunately, a lot of slave owners raped their slaves, and therefore those children were not their biological children, they were considered slaves as well. And that follows right here. And here's where it gets interesting. My picture's kind of in the way, but what it says here is a person of mixed white Indian blood should be returned as Indian, except where the Indian blood is very small. In other words, cut them some leeway, Or if they identify in the community more as white than Indian, call them white. So in other words, if you have a little bit of Negro blood, you're automatically Negro. But if you're Indian, we'll cut you some slack. So you can see it's not exactly scientific. It's based on social views and social values. And just like society, it is imperfect and it can be used to manipulate. Okay? So ethnicity, there's many different things that ethnicity evolves to. You can say that you are American. If you are an American citizen, have citizenship, whether you were born here or you became one, you can say that. But some people say that they are African American. And what does that mean? Does that mean that they came from Africa? Okay. What if they were born in Nigeria and moved here and became a citizen? Are they African American? Usually, when we say African American, we tend to think of people who have ancestry in American slavery, and that might be the difference. So it all depends. When I ask people, what does it mean to be Latino, right? Does it mean you're born in a certain country, or you speak a certain language, or you have a certain religion? It differs. And the thing about this is, these are collective identities, right? We decide what it is. People aren't born with Latino as a stamp on their soul. It isn't in their DNA. But what happens is people have decided, many people have gotten in the group and decided what does it mean to be Latino. And some of that is self-identification and some of that is from externally given. But here's an idea. Haiti. Haiti is on the same island as the Dominican Republic. It's in the Caribbean. The eastern half is the Dominican Republic. They speak Spanish. They were a Spanish colony. The western half is Haiti. It was a former French colony. They spoke French. Both were heavily populated with African Americans who were brought over for slavery. And after slavery ended, they still to this day, most of them have that same ancestry. But are Haitians Hispanic? And most people would say no. They don't speak Spanish. Their ancestry is African, and their colonial history is French. Now, the other side of the island, the Dominican Republic, they do consider themselves to be Hispanic, which is interesting because Sammy Sosa, who was a famous Chicago Cubs baseball player back in the 90s, from the Dominican Republic. He came here and automatically everybody assumed he was black because he looks as if he is what we consider black. Because, again, the people on the island of Hispaniola, the Haitians and the Dominicans, both have African American or African ancestry with the slavery trade. But he said, I was never called black till I came to the US. So again, all these different labels depends on who gives them and where they are given. So sometimes it's given to you, you don't have a choice. Sammy Sosa was called black. He looked like he was black. He was called black in this country. And that's imposed ethnicity. In fact, the people that were brought over during the slave trade came from many different countries in Africa, different cultures, different languages, different religions. But when they came here, they were all treated as one. And in a sense, the ethnicity that eventually became what we call black or African American was imposed on the beginning to these people from different cultures, right? Sometimes it's adopted. People will adopt the term Latino or Hispanic. Back in the 1960s, as it was allowed to be more diversity in our country, this idea of Chicano was one of the original terms for people about what we now call Hispanics. And people would self-identify by this. And the term has evolved. Now there's a term Latinx that people are using. And so that's adopted or symbolic. People choose that. Okay. We often see with race or ethnicity clustering. So neighborhoods, right? Chicago is a city of neighborhoods. We have a Chinese neighborhood, we've got white neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, Asian neighborhoods, all these different cultures, right? And that's clustering. What that means is people of a specific, ethnic or racial group live in close proximity. There's more people of that race in that area than would otherwise be normally, right? And sometimes that's a positive thing. So if you are an immigrant to Chicago from China and you are new to this country, Chinatown is a great support system. The stores sell food that you are familiar with. The people speak your language. It's a very familiar link and it allows you to kind of adapt to this new society. There are groups that help other immigrants get jobs and get housing. And for many ethnic groups throughout American history, they've had that. In New York, there were neighborhoods like Little Italy or Chinatown as well, where new immigrants would basically arrive and kind of transition to becoming Americans, right? Now, one thing we do find is how much clustering is going on. In other words, how Chinese is Chinatown? Is the population 80%, 60%? How much degree of clustering? In large part depends on how different the people that are living there are from the general population. So Chinatown in Chicago gets its beginning in the 1920s. And in the 1920s, there is much more difference between the Chinese immigrants and the average American, the dominant white population of Chicago. So Chinatown was extremely clustered. Today, there are neighborhoods that have a higher amount of people from, say, Ireland or Poland, and there are still immigrants coming, but the difference there is much less. They're not as distinct. The other part, unfortunately, and in large case in the United States, the main part of ethnic or racial clustering is discrimination. So until the 1950s and 60s, if you were African American, you were only allowed to live in one or two neighborhoods in the city. Today we find that hard to believe, even though it still happens. But up until the 1960s, it was completely legal to not rent an apartment to somebody because they were black or they were Chinese or whatever. You could choose not to sell your house to somebody based on their ethnicity. So that was actually a law, and it finally was changed in the 1960s. Before the 1960s, African Americans moved to Chicago in large numbers to work in the factories and look for work. They were only allowed to live in this narrow band, basically down what is Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. And it was called the Black Belt because it was this narrow strip of land where that was the only neighborhood they were allowed to rent in. And it became what we called a Bronze Belt, right? Discrimination lifts in the 1960s and 70s. It becomes illegal. It is now illegal in this country to do that. You can't use race as a reason not to rent to somebody. And what happens is these neighborhoods were so crowded with people living there, the people that could leave left. Now, how do we still explain that today? Um, in large part, there's still some discrimination. It may not be overt, but it also ties into the idea that race is also tied into usually with economic status, which is another class for another time. Okay, but these are created by power. The reason that ethnic neighborhoods exist is because somebody or some group in power has the ability to say you can't live anywhere but here. So they create them. And they're maintained by acts of power. If an African American family tried to move somewhere else, first of all, they were usually denied. And if they did move into another neighborhood, they might find themselves having their windows broken at night or bricks thrown at them, or even having their houses bombed, right? So those maintained those boundaries. You just knew not to leave. Okay. Now Chinatown in Vancouver is interesting. It's a result of institutional power. So in the 1880s, 1890s, the west coast of the United States and Canada saw Chinese immigration, but the Chinese were discriminated against, and they were only allowed to live in small neighborhoods, which became Chinatowns in Vancouver and San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Now, over time, as the Chinese immigrants assimilated and became part of the population, they started to decline. But in 1999, Hong Kong in China, which was a British colony, was given back to the communist Chinese government. And a lot of people in Hong Kong were Chinese, did not want to live under the Chinese communist government, and they had the money, so they moved. And so now Chinatown is where a lot of them ended up. It's actually one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, and people chose to live there in main part because, again, it had that support system of having a Chinese system in place, but yet people could have had the money. They could have lived anywhere. Okay. In these type of populations where you have different groups, for a long time we called it the melting pot. The idea that different groups would come to a country like the United States and they would gradually merge into one. But I think the more accurate view, and kind of where we are now, is the idea of polyculturalism, in that groups come to this country and they interact with each other and they change and evolve. They don't quite lose their complete differences, um, but they do a little bit, and as they do, they kind of affect the other cultures. So I think about the Italian immigrants who came to the United States in large numbers in the 1920s. At the time, were very exotic, but by the 1950s and 60s, pizza was considered commonplace, and everybody had spaghetti at once in a while. So I always make the joke Taco Bell, right? Taco Bell isn't really Mexican food, but it's not really truly American food. But maybe it is kind of American food. It's this kind of mixing, right? People move as well. So another way of looking at population is the people that are people who work downtown or people that take the train. That's a type of population. I mean, where you are right now watching this video might be where you are for the next 14 days, but if we were in school, right, that's a different thing. You'd be watching this video at home, but then when you're in class, you'd be in class, right? And so you have everyone has different space-time paths. So this person right here starts off at home, under my picture, and then at 10 o'clock they get on the bus to work, and then they're at work for 6 hours. So then they're here, and then after work they meet some friends at the restaurant, and they're here. So their path in space and time is different. Okay, and the rituals are constrained by time. So think about this: if I said to everyone here, I'm going to take you out to, I'm going to give you money for lunch. I'm going to give you $50. Go out and get lunch. You've got half an hour. Now, if we were at school, right, you could run down in the half an hour. Where could you go? You probably don't have a car, so you could go out maybe to Taco Bell or Subway or Chick-fil-A, right? But if you had a car out front, what if you could park your car right out front? You could drive to Portillo's, or you could drive over to the south, the west side, and then get back. So time is a factor, right? You have to be at work so many hours a day. That's a constraint on the movement, right? If your way of getting to work takes longer, that affects your movement as well. And so those are the pegs, the daily rituals constrained by time. And then just the access, right? And that measures this: the total area that you can access, the distance between work and home and school, right? That's all constrained by how much time you have and the ability to move. So most of us in Chicago who go to school live pretty close to the train so we can get to work, get to school. If you live in the suburbs, you have a much different commute. Your area is bigger. Your school might be much further away, or the mall where you go shopping. Seasonal movements. In cultures that are still relatively rural or nomadic, people might move with the seasons. So, excuse me, if people are sheep herders, for instance, a lot of cultures where they herd sheep that live in mountainous areas, in the summer, they will move up the mountain where there's fresh grass. So they move up the mountain in the summer and then back down when it gets colder in the winter. So they're moving up and down the mountains based on the seasonal movements of their sheep. In some areas, people live in the country during the fall to harvest, and in the city during the winter. They go back and forth. I think of this example right here, the ritual of vacation. Many of us know people who go south for the winter. Maybe they spend the winter in Florida, or they go down somewhere for Christmas, or maybe for spring break. So they're moving constantly that way as well. All right, I'm going to pause again the video right here, give you a chance to get up, stretch, go have a coffee or a soda, and we'll start with the next video in just a little bit.